Thank you so much for spending some time today to talk a little bit about design sprints, perhaps a different way to do them than maybe what's be a little bit more popular. My name is C. Todd Lombardo. I'm the chief design strategist at a company in Boston called Fresh Tilled Soil. And I actually wrote one of the first design sprint books that's out there. I can tell you the story perhaps some other day, but we published this maybe about 6 to 8 months before the Google guys did. It wasn't like it was a rush or a competition or anything. We tried to write it like a cookbook in that we give you the recipe for the 5-course meal, but yet if you just want to make the mashed potatoes from course 2, you can do that. So it's very step by step, whereas I think Jake and his team wrote theirs much more from a story perspective. Anyways, different styles, both very complementary. The approach that we take is a little bit different, and I'm planning to highlight probably some of the differences here because I know there's a lot of blogs and a lot of posts about the Google version, whether it be the Google Ventures version or the Google Developers version. There's actually a couple of different versions, like anything, and hopefully this will make sense. And it is a different way than probably you've seen, because everyone's got a process, right? And if you think about design processes, there's a lot of different types, and these are just a select handful that I pulled from different teams over the years. Most of these are consultancies, except the bottom one, which is Stanford, which I think is probably one of the first to really publish a sort of design thinking process or design thinking approach, which I think a lot of things have evolved from, and the sprint certainly evolved from that as well. If you think about those 5 phases of the Stanford's D School design thinking, you can start to say, well, this is adaptable to a sprint format. And my personal experience started, I was running these as an MBA design challenge week is what we were calling them. And I was sort of leading the MBA students through a 1-week version of this, which we were basically dedicating a day for each of these phases. And somebody at some point in 2010 or 2011 said, oh, you're doing a design sprint. And I said, oh, what? Okay, that's what these things are called. And so then I continue to call them from that. There's lots of different processes. This one's from IBM. We've seen the double diamond. There's a lot of these design processes, and a lot of them say similar things, right? This is where essentially that design sprint process came from. It's a combination of this design thinking, design process, combined with that agile sprint, time boxed, week-long type of approach, right? It's really an application of design thinking. So this is the sketch from the Google guys. It's a sort of a graphic from their version of it. This is Google Developers, and if you notice, there's actually 6 phases here. But then we start lining them up and say, all right, what's the difference here? How do they all look alike? I put Stanford's at the top of this screen just to give you a sense of where I think a lot of this evolved from, and even tracking what Google Ventures had published over the years, it's been a little bit different. And I think they came to a more colloquial language, map, sketch, decide, that was probably more broadly applicable than understand, diverge, converge, because especially if you're not, if you're a second or English is your second, diverge and converge may be more foreign terms than say sketch or decide. But what we focus on in the O'Reilly book is this bottom one in green: understand, diverge, converge, build, test. And I'll walk through each of these.
Todd,
phases.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I think you're still on the loop slide here.
Really? It should say, the slide I'm on says design sprint processes. Is that?
It is saying the loop drives us.
Huh. I'm like 4 on that.
And also, that's a bit of an echo on your end in the computer. I'm not sure if you're plugged into the Ethernet. Oh, there we go.
Check 1, 2. All right.
All right. I see you pulled out from
How's that?
Full slide view.
All right. I'm just checking my input volume and settings here.
Yep.
So oops, I got to close those out. Sorry, guys. Technology.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for your patience.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. So I think that it got stuck on this IBM slide, but I started going to these slides. Can you guys see
Yeah.
the design
Now
sprint
it's perfect.
processes slide?
Yep.
Great. Wonderful. Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, put the D school version up top as what I think is the map that a lot of people looked at as an initial guide. And people have had their own flavors, and even Google Ventures over the years has changed theirs a little bit. You can see the nomenclature has changed a little bit, but ultimately the ethos is very, very similar. But like anything, there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to run a design sprint, right? I'm going to focus on the bottom, which is what we wrote in the O'Reilly book, which is understand, diverge, converge, build, and test. This is that was just an example from the Google, I think, Sprint Kit page. And what I'll walk you guys through is, that first phase is understand. It's unpacking the problem. It's really pushing your thinking around really what problem are you trying to solve, trying to flesh out all of your assumptions around that problem, understanding who the user is, what the context of that user, of those problems, through some journey maps, some personas, and pulling all of that stuff out and get it visualized up onto the wall. One of the great things about the design approach is that visualization. I'm sure a lot of you have seen roomfuls of Post-it notes and sketches, and that's a lot of what makes a design sprint so great. Is it gets all of those thoughts, detailed information out of your heads, out of your PowerPoint presentations, of your Excel files, and gets them up onto the walls so that you can see a more holistic view of things and make decisions collaboratively. As it's the first day is really about understanding everything and unpacking everything. Once you've understood what the problem is, as that problem, and the context surrounding that problem, then it's time to generate some ideas around that. Okay, how can we solve for that problem? And you dedicate the entire day to solving that problem. You do a lot of different, probably 1,000 ways to do brainstorming and ideation. I'll walk you through the one way that we do it here, and structured, but there's a method to the madness. And you end the day with a bunch of storyboards that are essentially, three frame comic strips of your ideas, and they're stories about the ideas, or stories about these solutions. At the end of the day, you have a bunch of these. Maybe you might do some dot voting, but what you do is you go back and you say, let's go look at let's prioritize them and match up the ideas that we had to those. Some become a guide for which we select. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. I'm just doing a high overview right now. Once we've had those assumptions prioritized, what the critical thing for our product, then we'll make a prototype, and we'll make a prototype based on those assumptions and the ideas that match those assumptions. So again, those we choose type.
Sorry to cut in again.
No worries.
Sounds like the audio is coming in and out a little bit. I'm not sure if it's the internet connection on your end.
Let me see if I can. One thing real quick.
Sure.
How's this for an audio? Is it any better?
Yeah, that sounds better. Did you put on a headset or something?
Actually, the exact opposite. I had a headset and I just took it off.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, let's try this.
All right. I've got another fancy pair of headphones
it's
in my suitcase.
Cutting out a little bit there. I don't know if it's your internet. Are you connected on an Ethernet?
I'm in a hotel room in San Francisco, and I don't see a Ethernet cable here.
Okay, let's just try it without the mic plug-in.
Yeah. So we'll give this a shot. All right. So we have that. Where was I? Oh yeah, prototyping. So and prototype should help us figure out what those key assumptions are and what those ideas are. That they become a guide, and then we test it. We test it with people who are going to actually that product or service. But then we're done testing. We actually go back to our assumptions and say, well, were those assumptions valid, or were they invalid? And that helps us guide where to go after the sprint as well. And so those are some of the differences where I think at a high level, and I'll start digging into them a little bit more. I got the question of, well, isn't this lean startup or lean UX? And I would say there's elements of all of them in here. In that the lean startup may have seen this circle. You build it, you measure it, you learn it. But what often happens in frame is you start with, and then you measure and learn. And I think what often happens is you end up just building. So we want to do is really start there with data. Doesn't always have to be quantitative data. It could be qualitative data. So a design sprint really, you're going to learn. It's about accelerated. It's a bit poorly named in that design does not go faster. You don't push pixels faster. You don't design at higher speed. But it does give you clarity and answers around a particular design challenge that you may have. So, and ultimately, the ethos here is things people want is greater than making people want things, right? Where you're putting your energy, and hopefully it's to the left side of this and not the right side. Not that you don't need, but it's a lot easier to make things people want if you know what they want than to try to make people want things they don't need or care about. So let's go through each phase. And again, I'm not going to run through all the details here from a timing perspective, but just to give a quick high level of each phase on a little bit more detail and maybe show you some artifacts, and particularly trying to highlight what's the difference between this and maybe how the Google folks have described theirs. So in the understand phase, again, we're trying to unpack everything, right? So what background, what input do we have going into it? It might be some user research. It might be maybe you already have journey maps. That's great. Maybe you have some initial data from your product. Maybe you don't have much at all. Right? To understand what's that problem, what are the insights we can distill from the people who have that problem and the context or journey around that problem. We can actually crystallize a problem statement and maybe reframe it. So if we look at it from a different light, and by challenging our own thinking, we come up with a better problem statement, a more valuable problem to solve. And a big focus on this day, and you'll probably see this is throughout the week, is any product that's failed has failed because somebody along the way made a wrong assumption. And that's what you think you know. You don't necessarily have to back it up. You just think you know this. I'm sure, and let's just take a simple example. You probably have seen this problem before. This is that classic Disney Imagineer out of the box, right? Connect these 9 dots with 4 or less straight lines. Don't lift your pen once you started. Okay. Some people may struggle with this a little bit, but the classic solution is this. And this is where the out of the box comes from. And there's other ways too. So when you think about this, that assumption of our brains actually make a box around these circles, and we initially think we can't go outside of it, but there was nothing in the initial problem statement that said we couldn't, right? Also, if I had a really thick, I can do it in one short line, right? So it's an assumption about a pen. So before I even try to go off and solve this problem, this thing, I could think about what assumptions do I have? A big part of this understand day is to really flesh out our assumptions, and especially when you've got a whole variety of team members, you may have somebody on the tech team who has assumptions on what kind of tech stack it would be. Or maybe you have the marketing team or sales team is going to have certain assumptions around how they're going to sell or position. Whatever they are, the variety of that's going to be there may have different assumptions, and that's going to help you understand your problem a little bit better and understand your own biases and how you might try to solve it. And then once you've fleshed those assumptions out, usually we put them on a grid of risk and importance. So how risky are they to this particular problem we're trying to solve or design challenge we have, and how important is it that we need an answer this week? An example of a risk assumption would be a sprint I worked on was for a mobile app, and it was around the support of an email marketing service provider. initial overarching assumption that we actually called it out as a low risk was that you would actually go to the store or the Google Play Store and look for an app that had this function and download it onto their phone. So that was a big thing, because people wouldn't, our target audience at the end of the sprint was not going to go to the App Store and find this thing to solve the problem. They were going to do something completely different. So our was the wrong solution. We had to think about it for something different. So thankfully, we didn't build the app to solve it. We went off and built another product. Importance, high or low, is, do you need an answer this week in the 5 days of the sprint, or do you need an answer for the project overall? So that's how I tend to split. And typically what you want to do is you want to focus the sprint on this upper right quadrant of, it's really important, we need an answer this week, and it's very risky to the project. This is a way to start prioritizing them, because you might have a whole board full. And notice, even in our own biases in particular one, a lot of them ended up being in the top right, which is, human. Everything's important and everything is risky. And once we've gone through that, maybe gone through our personas, then we try to craft, by the end of the day, we try to craft a problem statement. And that's a challenge that has business value for a particular persona or set of personas, right? So challenge to persona. Ultimately, who, what, and why, okay? An example might be human resources lacks recruiting software. Actually, no, that's a really bad example. A better example might be human resources struggles to hire top talent to maintain a competitive advantage. Okay, that has the who, what, and why here, right? That gives us this problem statement that we can say, all right, this is the problem that we're going to try and solve, right? And it seems simple. This might be only 1-2 sentences long, but you might have taken the whole day to unpack this. However, the team has come together and aligned themselves around this particular problem to solve. And if any day goes long, it's usually the first day of the sprint. So once you have this problem, then it's time to figure out how to solve it, right? But also, as I said earlier, with the reframe, like, what are you really solving for, right? And some people ask, well, what do you mean by reframe? There's an example about a shoe manufacturer sending its 2 sales reps off to a new territory. One of them writes back, there's no opportunity, nobody's wearing any shoes. The second one writes back, there's a huge opportunity, nobody's wearing any shoes. Sometimes it's how you look at it, right? And another way to think about reframing a problem is to ask the question, why? So a simple problem might be, well, there's water on the floor. Well, what's our solution? It's a mop. But hang on, why is there water on the floor? Oh, well, it's a leaky pipe. Well, what's our solution? Let's fix the pipe, right? And if we just continue to do that, well, why? We started out with a mop as a possible solution, but we actually got to maybe a maintenance schedule or frequent inspections. So you can see that pushing your problem statement, pushing and asking why, and getting to something that's really going to solve a problem might be the thing to do. Because if you just mopped up the water, it might still come back tomorrow, and you might have water on the floor because the pipe's still leaky, right? It's what's the problem you really need to try and solve here that's gonna really deliver value to your customer, all right? And for the whole day, you get a detective, right? That's the understanding. You think like a detective. You're just the facts, ma'am. Get straight to the point. Just the facts. Try to understand things. That's what you're trying to do on the understand day. The diverge day, what you're trying to do is say, okay, we need to solve for these. We need to solve for that problem. And there's a number of ways we can do that. Again, as I said earlier, there's a lot of ways to brainstorm. I'm going to show you one structured way to do it. You can do this in a number of different ways. We start with job stories. We end up with storyboards, and we get there through doing the 6-ups. Some people may have heard of it as well. I often do 6-ups, especially with teams who aren't as generative or creative, just because it also lowers their anxiety a little bit. So job stories, 6-up storyboards, and that's the flow of the day. And typically it's we create job stories based on the journey maps. We create 6-ups based on those storyboards, and we end up with lots of job stories, lots of 6-ups, and a lot of storyboards by the end of the day. It's about generation. It's about generating a large quantity of ideas, because ultimately quantity begets quality, right? It's this continued pushing ourselves and thinking about that crazy idea, because even though the crazy idea may not be the one that we actually select to prototype, it might spawn us to think of a more realistic idea that's actually better suited to solving the problem. So some people ask, well, wait, what's a job story? I don't know what a job story is. You think about a job to be done, right? You may have heard the phrase, they didn't want a 1/4-inch drill, they wanted a 1/4-inch hole, right? Well, why did they want a 1/4-inch hole? Oh, they wanted to hang a picture frame. Okay. So the job stories are written, and this is thanks to Alan Clement at Intercom, sort of mashup of the jobs to be done framework from Clay Christensen at Harvard Business School and the user story, right? So when some situation happens, I have some motivation so I can achieve some kind of outcome. That's the basic framework, Mad Lib. And a good example might be, well, when it's 3 p.m. and I'm tired, I'm sleepy, I need to pick me up so I can be alert for my team. Notice there's a couple of different layers here. There's an emotional layer, there's a social layer, I need to be alert for my team, and there's a functional layer, keep me awake. So job stories can have all three of those elements, or maybe just one of those elements. Logically and rationally, as humans, when we're thinking about this, we tend to gravitate towards the functional, but if you can write job stories with a social or emotional layer in it, then you're really getting to the root cause of the problem sometimes that can help you think about a better solution. So if I was to do a 6-up for this, it might be, take a no-dose, do some jumping jacks, go take a cold shower, dump ice water on my head. Those kind of things can be different ideas to solve for this particular job story, right? So job stories, 6-ups, I don't think I need to explain them. They're a lot like Crazy 8s, 6 ideas, 1 minute per idea. Once you've got that, then you create some storyboards. And I think these are fairly straightforward, tend to be, limit them to 3 squares. So beginning, middle, end, simple stories. I think actually the next slide is a little bit clearer, right? So you do you take one of your ideas off your 6-up, and you flesh it out even further. If the 6-up is sort of a bunch of ways to solve it, you take one of those ways and say, let's flesh it out even further. So we're slowly expanding on that initial germ of an idea that we drew in a 6-up and saying, okay, let's think this through even further. And it should be written and drawn out in a way that's clear. So all of you here, all 1,359 of you, should be able to read this and get a general understanding of what this idea is, even though none of you were in the sprint, right? And that's the point behind having this fairly clear storyboard, so that when you have, let's say at the end of a sprint, you've got 23 storyboards, you can't have one person, you can't be reading them one person at a time. That's going to take a long time. You have a team of 5 to 7 people in your sprint, and you're going to read out loud 23 storyboards. It's going to take way too long. So if you write them in a way that they're quickly readable, you can just have everyone, put them on a table and just have everyone walk around and just read each one individually. That will take only a few minutes, because everyone will be reading in parallel rather than reading, one to many and having to do one at a time in sequence. The other thing that's good is sometimes you bring people in at the end of the day and say, hey, here are some of our storyboards. Which of the ones seem to resonate with you? And again, the point behind the Diverge Day is all about creation, right? Generate a lot of ideas to solve for that problem, even if some of them are a little crazy. So again, the flow is job stories, 6-ups, storyboards. And what you want to do is think like an artist, right? An artist is very generative. They create lots of things all the time. You want to be thinking like an artist on the Diverge Day. So once you've got your set of ideas, got a whole bunch of them, you haven't narrowed them down, you might have those 23, 33, 43 storyboards. And I've actually had some sprints where I've had literally in the 40s in the number of storyboards, and we have to converge down to 1 or 2 to actually build. So this converge process we talk about really goes back to those assumptions, right? What are those assumptions, and how can those assumptions help guide us? So we match up our assumptions in our storyboards, and then we do some sketching at the end of the day. Once we've clarified and prioritized which ideas we want to move forward, that sketching sort of is the first versions of that prototype. So first thing to do is we match up our existing assumptions to our storyboards, right? So we might have our storyboards, say, okay, of the assumptions we had thought about on the Understand Day, where do they match up, right? Certain ones match up with other ones. What about, do we have any new assumptions? Maybe we've actually realized that in certain ideas went in other directions that we actually didn't even think about. So we might have to do a little bit more assumption storming here just to match this up, right? Again, and this is probably a big difference where you see with our approach versus the way some of the others have done this, is we really focus on what are our assumptions around all these. And once we've done the matching, then we need to prioritize them, right? Here's just a photograph of what one might look like. So the one here, the blue, was the ones that were done on the understand day. And they say, oh, yeah, actually, these two storyboards had no assumptions that matched them from the first day, and they had to have a few other ones. It happens. Then you create an assumption table, right? An assumption table takes those assumptions, prioritizes all of them. And then you do, how do I test this assumption? And then once I've tested it, how do I know it's valid, right? And these should have your storyboards matched up, right? So once you identify these are your most critical assumptions, and you want to do this probably for your top 5 or so. If you have like 10 prioritized assumptions, you're probably not going to test them all in a sprint. It's just, you just don't have that kind of time. Most sprints I've done, you probably don't have much validation beyond the top 5 to 8 assumptions if you've really done this prioritization well. So you don't need to go much further than say 5 to 8 assumptions down. But it's good to record them and know what they are, because they may come back and bite you later, as exemplified by that earlier example I had on the mobile app, right? So here's an example of what that looks like. So the assumptions are ranked. You see we do it ranked by dollar vote, sort of a simple $100 test, which is a game storming activity. That prioritizes them. We've done okay, how are we actually going to test this? And then how do we know it's going to be valid? So let's just take a look at the top one. So this was around how somebody tracks something and how do they currently implement things. And we're going to show them a prototype specifically around analytics and tracking. And so all our ideas around analytics and tracking are over here. We didn't actually put the full storyboards. We just took the stickers off them for this particular journey map. But some assumption tables have the entire storyboard matched. The response was, if the elements that we put in that dashboard, they showed that there's some level of importance, and we watched what they were going to do with that data, right? So that's how we knew if this assumption around tracking the source of information was important to them. They actually did something with that data. Another example might be, we want to see if this person's going to sign up for an event. So do they actually sign up, right? It's valid if they say, yes, I will go to your event next Tuesday evening at 7:00. If your test participant does that, if they actually put it in their calendar, that could be a good validation criteria. Once you're done that assumption table, and this is probably the most heady part of the Converge phase. It takes a bit to think about. It takes a long time. There's a lot of debate usually around this part, matching up our assumptions, because one of the things we do it this way, the big reason why, is that sometimes in design thinking activities, people will hold on to their ideas and they will vote, like the dot voting thing. The dot voting thing is good to a certain point, but ends up, what's the criteria for your vote? How are you actually deciding where to put your dots? And people then just vote on their favorite ideas, which may or may not be the right ideas to actually solve the problem. Hence the reason for using assumptions to guide that selection and guide which ideas you really need to support that are the most critical to learn for your product or design challenge. Again, this is a way to help reduce any kind of like bias in idea selection. Or I know we don't use like a super vote example here, because that tends to say, well, this person has more knowledge than we do, so they're going to trump. Gets to go-driven development, which is something I'm not a big fan of. This is why we really focus on the assumptions guiding our process, or guiding our selections over other things. So once we've got that table, and that takes a good, pretty much the entire morning of the third day, at least. Then noon, we're doing ritual descent. So we'll go take each. So if we see this, for example, we would take these 3 little storyboard, and we would sketch out a prototype, and specifically for that row. So row by row, we would go down and say, oh, okay, this is the prototype that's going to test this assumption. This is a prototype of this assumption. And so we'd sketch out the individual prototypes to test the individual assumptions first. Then we do something called a ritual descent, which is quite fun. Ritual descent, it's you present your sketch in 60 seconds, and then you put it down on the table, and you have to turn around, and then the team have basically 3 to 5 minutes to tell you why it's the worst sketch in the world, why it will not validate that assumption, why they hate it. it's all negative, and the only thing you can say 2 words: thank you. And what it does, it gets you a quick set of feedback on what's wrong with that, a quick iteration before the end you'd have your final sketches. And really, the day is all about thinking like a scientist, right? What are my assumptions? What's our hypothesis? What's our validation criteria? This day is really about bringing that scientific mindset to this. How are we going to create, craft, and implement what we're trying to do on the Converge day is not only select our idea, but use a very rigorous, quasi-science-like process which ideas move. And then prototype. I'm not going to get too much into prototyping because my assumption is a lot of people here, there's a lot of ways to prototype. But I'll talk a little about why we heard the spaghetti challenge, the marshmallow challenge. The marshmallow challenge is in 18 minutes or less with these particular materials, you've got a free structure. And the marshmallow has to be on top. And what happens is the average is, the height ends up being about 20 inches high on average. Then you start to segment who's doing this. You see that business school students do terrible. Lawyers do worse than average. But kindergarten kids and architects do better. And then CEOs do just slightly better than average. And one of the interesting things about the comparison between a business school student and kindergartner is that kindergartner is building this. They're actually putting the marshmallow on top really, really soon, within about 5 minutes. Whereas the business students wait is built, and then they want that ta-da moment at the end, right? So you could equate this to a development cycle of saying, oh, we're going to spend 4 months on the product and then launch it. But a design sprint is kind of like doing this thing like, hey, we're going to actually spend 5 days trying to build something and test it before we actually go spend 18 days building and testing it, or whatever, 18 months, whatever that ends up.
Todd, sorry to cut in here. It looks like there's still some issues with the audio. I resent an invitation to you for you to dial in. Would you mind trying that real quick?
Not at all. Sorry, guys.
All right. Yeah, no worries. Thanks, guys, for the patience here. Todd, let me know if you see the invitation that I just resent you a couple minutes ago. And
so is this? Hang on one sec. Can I just where do I audio options? Okay. So can I just go do the phone call?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm talking about. Do the
screen. Let's try that. Right on.
All right, everyone. We'll get back on track in just a moment here.
To Zoom, enter your meeting ID followed by the pound or hash sign.
Okay, is this any better?
Oh, perfect.
Okay.
All right, let's get this back on track.
All right, sorry y'all, technology. Okay, so the reason why kindergarten students do well is because they're testing sooner, and that's exactly why we're prototyping, right? We're prototyping, we're building to learn. We're building to think. We're not building just to build. We're really building to think and prototyping to think and help us test. And I call these prototypes in a design sprint a minimum viable concept, not a minimum viable product, a concept, because really that's what we're trying to get across. It's not something that's ever going to go into production. Sure, there may be iterations after the sprint, but they're really concept prototypes we're trying to get answers to realize we're on the right track. So think like an architect in this, right? You're thinking like an architect, how to build something. Architect looks at a space and says, all right, what do I need to build here? Okay, that's really the mindset you want to have for the prototype.
Sorry, Todd, the screen right now is still showing the business student and kindergarten slide.
It's still showing what?
The kindergarten student and the business student slide. There we go.
There we go. Okay.
Yep. Perfect.
Cool. Right. So prototypes are minimum concepts, right? Think like an architect. You guys seeing this one?
Yep, perfect.
Great. Okay, cool. So that's the prototyping. So testing is next, right? That's the next phase. Hopefully you've been able to line up your test participants. And I didn't talk too much about how to find them or how to line them up. That's something we can maybe talk about in Q&A. There's lots of ways to find them, especially if you're in B2B, they tend to be a little harder to find. So finding panels or having, basically having somebody else outside the sprint help you line them up once you've identified who they are is really helpful. And when you're doing testing, sometimes people say, oh, come into our office or come here. But I actually say, like, think about this. If you're going to go observe a lion, observing a lion in the wild, you're going to learn something very different than if you observe a lion in a zoo. So if you can actually go to the wild and test there, you're going to learn a lot more. You're going to see the context of where your product may actually be used. So if you can go there, do it. So we break our tests down into 3 basic areas. We call it pre-roll, which is sort of the basic get to know you questions, the actual presentation of the prototype, ask them to use it in some way, and then follow up with any kind of we call post-roll questions, right? So a pre-roll might be so how do you currently do this thing? How do you currently manage your data? How do you currently look at these analytics? What do you currently do with them? So it establishes that background and it establishes that rapport with your test participants. Then once you've gotten through that, what are the things you want to prototype? And these typically match up to your particular assumptions, right? You're going to ask them to do something with this data. You're going to show them an analytics screen. You're going to see how they react to it. You're really looking for behavior. What you do not want to do is say, do you like this? Yes or no? Because that's not really what you're trying to get to. They're going to lie to you. People will lie to you. It's very clear. And they don't do it intentionally, but they will lie to you. They'll say, oh yeah, that looks great, but they'll never actually buy it, right? So you want to understand very softly how they're going to use these things, right? Which is why that prototype, that minimum viable concept becomes basically a catalyst for conversation, and you see that reaction to them, and you have to filter that, like, oh, what did that really mean? And the post-roll are things like, well, how does this compare to how you do this thing today? Or how does this compare to other things? More of that sort of wrapping up the interview, getting them to, you don't want to do these. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I tend to not like those questions because they're very subjective. And again, if you're doing an in-person test, which most of these usually are, people will lie to you. They'll say, oh yeah, it's an 8. And they're just doing it to be nice, right? They don't want to hurt your feelings. They don't want to look like a jerk. So those questions tend to be a bit challenging, or I don't think give you the right information at this stage. So you really just want to ask those are very targeted, open-ended questions. And the point is not to guess, right? That's why we're doing testing. We are not guessing, we're testing. And if anything, it's just be as curious as you possibly can and really think like a journalist, right? That journalist, they're an investigative reporter, they're asking questions, they're trying to build rapport with the person that they're talking to so that they get the trust, they get them to tell me the story, tell me the details, the things they may not tell anyone else. That's really what we're trying to do on the test day. So once you've done this, you've got all your test results, well, what worked, what didn't? Then you go back to that assumption table and say, well, okay, well, based on what we learned, what are these assumptions valid or invalid, right? And notice the check marks here are the ones that we validated. The ones that with question marks are the ones that were like, well, we're not so sure, right? So having this list of assumptions table is a great way to go back and say, yep, this was true. Nope, we're not sure. We need more information, etc. So okay, now you've done this. You've got some things are valid, some things are invalid. Now what, right? And a lot of people say, well, okay, what's next, right? So if you have your sprints, maybe afterwards, you do some intervals. If it completely failed, maybe you need to stop and say, all right, what else are we going to do? Let's do something else. But if the project needs to move forward, what do you need to refine? What assumptions need to change? Refine your assumptions, refine your prototype, build that prototype, and then go test it again. You can do like the 5K, right? Instead of doing a design sprint, do these intervals. They might take a week or 2 or 3. Maybe you need to track something over a longer period of time. For example, maybe your product has a 30 or 60-day trial period and you want to track something over that. So after your design sprint, you might do one of these intervals that lasts a month. So you're tracking the different cohorts over that month. There's a number of different ways to do those things. And you might do that. Maybe you have to build in the product. Maybe you don't have to build in the product. There's a lot of different ways you can go after this, but usually it's very dependent on the outcome. And ultimately, I say it's the mindset, right? That's a big thing about the design sprint is, that first day is about being a detective, right? What's going on? Give me just the facts, ma'am. What's the problem? Let's understand this. What's all the evidence, right? What evidence do we have today? Second day is about being an artist and being creative. How do we solve for that, the problems that we uncovered and identified? Once we've solved, or at least we think we solved them, we have a whole bunch of ideas, then we have to be very scientific in which ideas we select. Be very rigorous on which ideas to select so that we're kind of mitigating our bias in selection of those ideas. And then we got to build them and then test them. And that's really the mindset we need to have. If I extrapolate this even more so, you really need to that designer mindset of being empathic, being a maker, being very forward-looking, and a scientist, which is rigorous, experimental, and very hypothesis-driven, or what I like to call a designtist. Yes, I'm here all week, ladies and gentlemen. But really, the design sprint is a mix of really three things. You've got the scientific method, you get your design process, and agile philosophy. Notice I'm not saying agile process, because I think agile is not a process. Agile is a mindset and a philosophy. There are processes like Scrum or Kanban that we have used to give ourselves a ceremony to do agile or to be agile, but agile itself is that being flexible, having customer collaboration, working products over comprehensive documentation. Those are the things in the Agile Manifesto that we want to bring into the design sprint. It's really a mix of those three. It's much easier to build anything than to build the right thing, right? We have technology today is amazing. We can build almost anything we can imagine. It's a matter of building the right thing for our users that are going to deliver value, because it's so much easier to do that. It's really hard to build the right thing. It's really hard to understand what the true needs are, right? And this is why we have processes like this to help prevent it, so we can avoid spending a ton of money. There are examples like Color.com or Airtime.com where they've literally spent tens of millions of dollars building a product that nobody uses. And let's not do that, right? Let's put those resources to better use. And part of it is those things are more ego-driven development. Like, I think I know what the customer needs, so I'm going to go off and build this thing. But it turns out that doesn't happen. So when we do these kinds of approach, this kind of rigorous or thoughtful approach up front, very experimental, we can figure out what the right thing to build is and then go off and build it. And speaking of building what's right, of building something right, does your team focus on what is right? Or does your team focus on who is right? One of the things that I like to use the design sprint for is to really focus on what's the right thing, right? Not necessarily who has the biggest opinion, who has the loudest voice, who has the largest number of dot votes or super votes. It's what's right for us to do. And let the evidence determine that. Don't let somebody's opinion or ego drive that. So that's really what we think the Use the Design Sprint is. And Ash Maurya, a fellow iReilly author and also of Scaling Lean, it's too short to build something nobody wants. So let's build the right thing. Okay. So that's the sort of non-Google approach. I apologize for the audio. Hopefully we've got this sorted. Happy to answer any questions that you guys may have.
Great, thanks, Todd. That was fantastic. Yeah, we've got quite a few questions here. I'm gonna go ahead and launch the same poll we always launch at the end, and I'll drop in your book in the in the chat box here again, and then we can go ahead and get started here. All right, let's take a look here. Cool. And just as a reminder, if you have more than 3 years of design experience, check out Product Tribes, which is our Slack group of 3,600 designers, developers, and product managers. So I just dropped that in there again. And of course, C. Todd's book here is available on Amazon, and it's a very useful book. This is another book that we actually have on our bookshelf as well. So we have this one and the Google Sprint book. And let's get this from Amazon here. And I'll drop that in there. Meanwhile, we will go ahead and dive into some questions here. So first question we have is a kind of general question, which is, if you had to point out just a few items, where do you think that your approach and the Google approach sort of differ?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is with the assumption. So we really put a big focus on calling out your assumptions and building your prototype and testing around those assumptions. So that's probably one of the biggest differences between ours. So I think we have a little bit more of a scientific take than they do, but a lot of the exercises are similar. Like I said, ideation stuff, it's very similar. You can do a lot of the same thing in slightly different ways. But I think it's the real focus on assumptions and that validation table being the real heart of the entire week.
Gotcha. And the next question we have here is, so this person, their company has the agile, Scrum methodology, and they're curious how would you incorporate a design sprint within a Scrum team? Is this something that is, is this a repeating process that you run week in, week out, or is this something you just insert at certain points for really intense focus?
Yeah, great question. Really great question. Because you're asking is, when do we do this? And if your team does Scrum, let's say your Scrum cadence is every weekly or bi-weekly, that's great. It's an as needed basis. And the reason when you do a design sprint is when you have something that's a high level of uncertainty. When you have we need to rethink our dashboard because we're not quite sure of how our customers are using it, or maybe we have some data that give us some initial direction, but we need to do some exploration there. You may have heard the phrase directed discovery. That's another, when you have an element, when you're not actually looking to build something, right? You don't have validation that, okay, I might have a problem identified or maybe a problem area, but I don't quite have the solutions yet. Because Scrum is more about execution, saying, I'm going to deliver it using this Scrum to actually deliver and execute an output. Scrum is much more output focused. A design sprint's a little bit more outcome focused. We're trying to get the answers first before we go off and build it. So in terms of going to answer your question, you might have this as an as-needed basis, like, oh, we need the example about the dashboard. Let's go run a design sprint for a week, and then let's say you've got a typical Scrum cadence is 2 weeks, right? So your first week you do a design sprint, your second week maybe you're doing some synthesis and digestion, and then you're getting ready to actually maybe put it into Scrum if you got to build something. If you've learned enough during those 2 weeks, it's much more about learning than about building. I can't stress that enough. It's really much more about learning than building.
Gotcha. The next question here is actually really interesting, which is Alan Clement and Intercom, are both not big fans of personas. And you mentioned that a problem statement needs to talk about who, what, and why. And so how do you define the who in that situation then? If you're not using personas, what is the tactic for getting a better understanding?
Yeah. So I think I don't necessarily go to that extreme about that Alan does about like not getting away from personas completely. We actually do use personas. So we would use the persona in that first day of saying, okay, here's that who and here's the problem we have. So that we would use that, and we even use that under the when we use job stories. So we kind of take a little bit from Alan, but we don't buy into every single thing he says. Even though I still think there's a lot of value to personas, and so we still use them. So we use both. Hopefully that explains that.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely helpful. Another question we have here is really about timing. So some people may not have the time to do a whole week for a design sprint. Is it possible to shrink this down into less time, or is that too intense?
Yeah, so hang on, let me share my screen again. I've got call them the agenda hacks. So these, let's see, just close these up on. Okay, so where's my cursor here? Okay, so it's really hard to compress this. I remember talking to a client, they're like, oh, this sounds great, can you do it in a day? And I almost fell over. I said, you realize that we're compressing an already robust design process into a week, and you're saying to compress it even more. So the answer is, sure, you can do that, but you're going to miss out on things. The shorter you do all of these exercises, one, you have to skip some exercises, and you just can't go deep. Right? We live in such a distracted world. One of the magical aspects of a design sprint is getting a team in a room focused on one problem, one area for a few days. And it's amazing what happens when we have that kind of focus, because we have so many things distracting us. Everyone is so overburdened. So there are some things you can do. We call them agenda hacks. One that has worked really, really well, it's still over 5 days. We call it the shorter day. So rather than doing like a full 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. kind of day, you do started at 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. So the teams have a little bit in the morning and a little bit in the afternoon, evening to take care of their quote unquote day job. But they have the middle of the day to focus on the sprint activities. And Thursday, typically we'll have only people in the room for an hour or so just to get set up. And then the designers are usually off building the prototype. And then we bring everyone back in for the test on Friday, or everyone goes out in the field and does the testing. So at the very least, sometimes it's like, all right, I need everybody in the room for these 3 days in these, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And then when it comes to Thursday, I just need you for like an hour. And then Friday, maybe if you can attend the interviews, if you can't, usually have 2 people leading the interviews and then others attending as necessary. But what you don't want to do is have 5 different people do the 5 different interviews, because then that's just going to really get significant layers of bias and other types of, it's basically going to kind of poison your results. You really want a consistency of who's running the test. Another thing to do is invite certain people at certain times. So this was actually Trace Wax. This was his idea, and I've used it a bunch of times. It's worked brilliantly. If you can't get the executive or the VP or the high-ranking official in the room, bring them in at the beginning of the understand phase, when you're getting around the problem statement and assumptions. When you're doing that aspect of it, then bring them back in for 15 minutes at the end of the converse phase. Like when you're saying, okay, look, here's our assumptions table. Remember, you can even point to remember your assumption around this, it's there, it's ranked number 2. And here's our sketches of what we want to build, right? They feel included in the process, and they can offer some commentary and feedback on where they are. But again, by being visual, by posting everything up on the wall, they should be able to see this. And then bring them in again when you do that retrospective, going back, line by line, saying, all right, was this assumption valid or invalid? Bring them back for that 30 minutes of the retro, and they'll have had some co-creative, some co-creation element to it, and they'll have seen your work, and they'll have heard how you're thinking about this. And even at just those 3 points was super helpful for any kind of executive buy-in on this. I've tried to do it over 4 days. That's probably the closest I've done to compressing it in terms of number of days. You just sort of combine the diverge and converge. I would actually take a good lunch between diverge and converge, because they are 2 different mindsets, right? You're going from the artist to the scientist, and you want to have that break to reset your brain a little bit. But I've also seen people, schedule them out over a couple of weeks or a bunch of different weeks. And there was one team that I interviewed that actually did a design sprint they basically did 4 hours a day over 4 weeks. And they just did little chunks every Tuesday, Thursday, Tuesday, Thursday, Tuesday, Thursday. And they just chunked their sprint out in that way. I've tried a number of ways, but I found that it's really hard to compress it more than 4 days. And that focus really helps, right? That focus in space can really help you get things done.
Yeah, that's fantastically useful, those slides there. And just so everyone knows, the slides and the recording, of course, is going to be sent to everyone afterwards. And so all 90-something slides of those, you guys will be able to review and apply on your own time. And actually, we've got another really interesting question here, sort of related to timing. And this popped up yesterday during John's presentation as well, which is, considering that a design sprint is usually just a week, how do you recruit users in that short period of time? Or are you testing against just employees during that?
Yeah, great question. And there's a lot of challenges around that, because sometimes it's really hard to find and schedule your test participants in just a few days. So there's a couple of ways that we've used to try and tackle that. Most of the clients that I work with are, mostly B2B. So what we typically do is when we work with these, say, okay, look, if we're testing your current customers, let's get a customer list going, yeah, and let's figure out who we could talk to that we can start to think about lining up. And so once we've identified, by the end of that first day, once we've clarified and identified that persona or those set of personas we need to talk to, we'll pick those 5 to 10 people and try to schedule them. Always schedule 8 to 10 because usually almost guaranteed 1 or 2 drop out. So one of the things to do is work with your teams to say, all right, who are our customers? Reach out to your current customers if it's your current customers you're testing. If it's prospects, work with your sales and marketing team to try and understand who are our prospects and can we at least find somebody like them, or maybe I can have a customer refer us to somebody. What we did when I was in the Innaloft, we built a database of customers and non-customers that we ultimately could go back to. So we had a subset of our customers. So Constant Contact had like 700,000 customers. We had a small database of about 5,000 to 10,000 customers that agreed to be part of this panel. And we knew all about them. We knew who they were, where they were from, what kind of persona they were. And we also recruited off using Facebook and Google AdWords, other people into this database so they would agree to be part of this. And we tried to not incentivize people with saying, hey, we'll give you a $50 gift card if you give us 30 minutes of your time. We try to actually not incentivize that. We try to really go on the, oh, hey, you've got this problem. We'd like to show you a solution that can help solve it. And then we'd still send them a gift card, but we send them after it. We'd basically send them the gift card after saying, hey, thanks so much for spending time with us. Have lunch or dinner on us, that kind of thing. It was a nice delighter afterwards, and it made people, happy with the time they spent with us, regardless of the outcome. So, because sometimes you can poison your results by asking for somebody to just do it for the money. I definitely have had a few of those people. Like the first question they ask me is, so do I get my $100 today? And I'm like, oh. So right. Hopefully that helps. It is a challenge, but trying to think about that even before you start the sprint is really helpful.
Right. The next question here is about execution after the sprint. And so there's a few questions, mentioning that basically after you run a design sprint, you might end up with 3 to 6 weeks worth of work. How do you ensure that the team actually executes on some of those follow-up items so that this design sprint doesn't just happen in a vacuum?
Yeah, great question. I think a big part of it is, that validation table, those assumptions, and that prioritized assumption list is a big part of it, and just documentation. So it's not like we need to document, in detail the sprint. What we do is we basically take an Excel sheet or a Google sheet and we just codify it. So we could take everything off the Post-it notes at the end of each day, throw it into a Google spreadsheet, and if it needs some kind of readout or report out, we'll actually put some document together. Like usually when we first started doing these, when I started doing these in early 2013, we were creating these 50-page reports, which was just insane. We realized that an executive summary was all we needed that listed the high level, assumptions, what we did, and, basically sort of prototype. But then really was that spreadsheet that basically said, okay, here's all the stuff from our Post-it notes in the structures that we had. This is our personas, these are our hoodoos, this is our journeys, these are our assumption table. The links to the InVision prototypes or whatever kind of prototypes we use, maybe they're UX Pin prototypes, whatever they are, we would have links to those. And then, the results, there'd be some summary of results, what happened and what needs to happen next. So that codification would be the driver for any future work. But that varies per sprint because every sprint's really different. So some sprints had, real heavy amounts of, big, large validation tables that had a lot of meat behind them. And some of them were yeah, we had 2 assumptions. They were, one was valid, one was invalid. This is what that means. So it's really about just good documentation and good communication amongst your team as to what's next. Right.
And actually going back to talking about team dynamics here, there was a couple questions about, does the structure of activities or the timeline change if your team is smaller? So for instance, if somebody is only working or they only have 1 or 2 other people to work with, does that change how long we run a design sprint for?
Probably not. Maybe you might be able to get away with some shorter days, but unlikely it will make it too much shorter. You might be able to get away with a 4-day or maybe a 3-day, but you're still going to want, like, you can't compress your testing. That's just not going to happen. And you really don't want to compress your prototyping. You really want to give yourself at least a good full day to prototype the thing. So you want to get it robust enough, right? You're not building to build this beautiful thing. You're building just enough to validate or invalidate your assumptions. That's what you're doing. You're not building a prototype that's going to go off into production the next day. So that's an example. I think another question that often comes up that's similar to this is, can it be remote? And depending on the size of your team. And I'd say with the thing about remote, I've done a few of them now. I've only done a handful of actual remote sprints. But the thing is, if it's not like you can have like 5 people in a room and 1 person remote, that doesn't work very well. Or you have like 2 people in a room and 1 person remote. Everybody needs to be remote. So that's when you need to actually just put all your artifacts online. So use something like Murally or BoardThing or any kind of those online collaborative, sketching, post-it note type of platforms. Put everything on one of those so that everyone is forced to put stuff there. And then use the asynchronous nature of remote work, especially if you're crossing time zones, to your advantage, right? So you would say, hey guys, let's hop on for an hour at this time. And let's look at the results of, what we both put up for the Hoodoo exercise. Or I filled in this part of the assumptions table, you fill in that part. We'll circle back at this time and, spend a half an hour reviewing these things. So use that asynchronous nature or affordability of that remote gives you to allow for that kind of workflow. It does change how you do it though, because it's really hard to beat everyone in the same room, but I definitely realize that we're going to a more distributed world. So that's something that can be done. I should just use that asynchronous nature on an online platform.
Right. And it's interesting you mentioned Mural because yeah, I've used that tool before, and it's very useful for any sort of remote ideation and early stage design work. So it's cool to see that. It's you guys have also I found that.
Yeah. Actually, I need to talk to Jim Callbeck, who's one of their guys. He actually is another O'Reilly author. And
oh yeah, Jim. Yeah.
I think I need to he's awesome. I think we need to just go and just like create templates for the design sprint. Just like, hey man, here's some templates that people can use and go for it. That might be helpful.
Yep. And I've dropped that tool link here in the chat as well for people. Definitely check out Mural. It's a very useful tool. The next question here is about a tactic you talked about during the presentation, which is the $100 test. Could you just explain that a little bit more? What exactly?
Sure. Yeah, so the $100 test is kind of like I'm sure you're familiar with the dot vote, where like everyone gets a couple dots. They post a dot to their favorite activity or favorite element, whether on the board, whether it be a storyboard or sticky note. $100 test takes it to the next level and says, all right, if I give you 100 virtual dollars, or maybe 100 virtual yen or 100 virtual euros, whatever currency you like, got 100 points, right? And I need to invest that $100 into what assumptions are going to be the most critical, right? Where am I going to invest? Where am I going to put my money to invest? Because I think these assumptions are the most critical. So it's just a way to stack rank them so that you once you've done them, let's see if I can pull up the slide again too. Here. Right, so everyone has voted on these, and notice that it actually looks initially like that each of these top 4 assumptions have $50 each. You really want to stack rank them to see which one's more important than the others, which one's the most critical. And actually, if you look at the 5th row, it says C number 1. We actually, as we went through this, we realized that this assumption right here was actually pretty much the same thing as the top one. So the top one ended up becoming $80 instead of $50. So it ended up being the most critical assumption for us to test. So the $100 test itself is a way to stack rank things. So you actually get a 1, 2, primary, secondary, tertiary order of things, rather than just like, oh, these 5 different assumptions all have 4 votes to them. You really want to try to get more of a hierarchy there, so that you get which one is more important or more critical than the others. So that's the reason behind it. You can look it up on gamestorming.com. I think it has applicability beyond this assumption table. Any kind of ranking you need to do, you can run this test.
Got it. We'll take 2 more questions because we are approaching. We are past time.
Yeah, we're a few minutes over.
Yeah.
I'm happy to stick around. I got about another 4 minutes or so.
Yep. So that's perfect for another 2 questions. And the next question we've got here is, this is really about picking the people to be involved. And so how do you choose sort of the key players in a design sprint, deciding who facilitates versus who participates at what time?
Yeah, great question. I think what you really want to do is think about having the team who's going to work on the project be in the sprint. So you've got maybe a product manager, a designer, or a UX person, maybe an engineer if you can. It's really good because sometimes they can call out some feasibility aspects as you're going through it, and some of their assumptions maybe around the feasibility of doing some of these things might be helpful. You might want to get a marketer in. It really depends on who's going to touch this product in getting it out to the world, or who has this design challenge or this challenge to actually tackle. The cross functionality is super helpful. So if you have 2 engineers working on it, it might not be you might want to pull in somebody else from other parts of your organization. What we did at the Interloft was we started inviting people on the ideation day. So on the Diverge day, we would invite a bunch of different people across the organization that didn't have much of a relationship to the project, partly because we wanted to expose them to the design sprint itself. So wanted to help maybe scale the process across a 2,000 plus person organization. But also just to get that different opinion, somebody who may not be so heads down in it as we are. The other thing you'll need to do when it comes to picking the team is pick somebody who's going to be a good facilitator. Having the product person who's responsible be the facilitator is actually not a good idea. So have the designer or the engineer, somebody else facilitate, unless they're a really strong facilitator, right? It's good to have that facilitator be the third party and have the product person or designer be the participant, because they're actually more valuable as a participant than as a facilitator. So that's another thing is when I run this with my MBA teams, I actually have the teams are usually 5 to 6 people each. I said, look, one of you has to play facilitator. So you're not the one who's going to be doing the sketching or doing all, writing the stuff on the Post-it notes. You're going to be timing and facilitating the group. And it's a different role to play, because when you're playing that player coach, it's really hard, especially if you're just starting to do something. If you've never done a design sprint before, it's really hard to do both facilitate and play at the same time. So try to just pick one role and do that.
Right. And we will take the last question here now, which is, again, going back to user research. And the question here is, so do you conduct, or do you recommend that teams conduct their user research prior to day 1 of the sprint so that they have a foundation for understanding the problems and the assumptions that need to be tested? And if not, have you ever been in a situation where research had to be part of the design sprint itself?
So yes and yes. So yes, if you are able to do some interviews ahead of time, or have some kind of design research, or you have research that's codified and packaged, you can bring as input into the sprint, then you can unpack it during the sprint. So for example, there's going to be one client we're working with in a couple of weeks. They went and done a whole bunch of research, and they said, look, we've got all this research. We've got video and audio tapes. We got some synthesis and summaries. We need you to come in and help us run this through a sprint. So we're going to review that material before the sprint, but then we're going to actually examine it and unpack it on that first day. I've also done it where I've actually done an understand phase over 2 days. When I started doing them at Constant Contact, we actually did that understand. I called it understand and define and understand. And what really was is trying to just make 2 days of understand. So once we've had some initial clarity around the problem that first morning, we would then get out of the building at noon, and then we'd go off and do some research in the afternoon. It was a little bit more guerrilla type, but it also might be hey, we're going to spend Monday afternoon talking to people and synthesize and then understanding things like we're going to go out, go into the wild, go see them, don't go to the zoo, go to the wild, find that lion in the wild and see what they're up to. And then we bring things back on Tuesday morning, and then we do further the rest of the exercises on the understand phase to really clarify what problem we're trying to solve. So I've definitely done it that way, but I do recommend if you can do some research up front, it's way better. Even if it's just like 5 to 10 interviews of your target persona, super great.
Right. And with that, I think we can close out the Q&A. I would say that, see, Todd, I'll invite you into the Slack team, and for everybody else here, obviously we can get to all the questions here, but we do have a virtual lobby in our Slack team. And if you have more than 3 years of experience on a product team, we encourage you to apply for it. I have included the link there. Otherwise, see, Todd, that was a fantastic presentation. Very practical, lots of details. We got a lot of great positive feedback from people here in the chat box and
wonderful
in the Q&A box. And I think we had well over 1,200 people attending, which is a great.
That's awesome. Hey, thanks again, Jerry, for inviting me and hosting me. I'm happy to answer any further questions. I'll try. You guys can reach out to me over Twitter. I'll definitely try to be as helpful as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll drop in the book one last time because, again, this book really just expands on the ideas that are talked about here in much even further detail. And so I think it's a great sort of practical manual. We have an office bookshelf here, and it's one of the books that we've got here, along with a lot of other O'Reilly and Rosenfeld media books.
Wonderful.
So yeah, guys, check out all that stuff there. The presentation slides and the recordings will be sent out. We're aiming for the end of the week and early next week at the latest. And so you'll have that whole 90-slide presentation on hand as well to reference for your own work. Otherwise, the next session we have is starting in about 15 minutes here, actually. And that is going to be talking about agile prototyping best practices. So hopefully you guys can join us for that session there. Otherwise, see, Todd, thanks so much for your time. This was fantastic.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Jerry. I'll get you the deck at some point so you can make it available.
Yeah, absolutely. You can just email it to me afterwards and we'll put it up. Yeah, have a great rest of the day, man.
Cheers.
All right. Take care, everybody.